Eleanor Rooke has sold eggs and winter greens at the Harrowgill market cross for 31 years. She knows every stone of that square. And every Thursday, since the grass on her husband's grave went green, a liveried man in the Aldermere colours buys her whole stall by 9 o'clock. Every loaf, every jar, every last bunch of kale still stiff with frost. He pays fair coin, tips his hat, and goes. And in 10 winters, she has never once known why. She never asked. A widow does not question good custom. 10 winters of it. 500 market days, near enough, the whole square watching the same silent purchase. The Duke of Aldermere himself came only once, gloved, straight-backed, and spoke 4 words at her stall. The brown loaf, always, then he left. Never more than that. Never a reason. But this Thursday is different. This Thursday the eviction notice is nailed to the old market cross, in front of the whole town, and for the first time in 10 winters, the Duke does not send his man. He comes down himself, on foot, and he asks to speak with her. If you believe it's never too late for the heart, this story is for you. Before we go on, if a story about patience and second chances is the kind you like, subscribe, and comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels tonight. Now, let me take you back to that raw Thursday in Harrowgill. The North Riding of Yorkshire, in the year 1873. Harrowgill is a small market town folded into the dales, all grey stone and green hills, with a river running cold beside it. In winter, the wind comes off the moor and finds every gap in a woman's shawl. And on the Thursday our story begins, it was that kind of cold. Eleanor Rooke rose at 4. She always did. The fire was down to a red eye in the grate, and she woke it with kindling before she woke herself. She was 57 that winter. A wide woman, strong through the shoulders from 30 years of lifting baskets, with grey coming in at her temples and hands that had never been idle a day. Her husband Thomas had built the cottage with his own hands. He had been a joiner, the best in the dale, and he had been 10 years in the churchyard now. She still slept on her own side of the bed. She baked before dawn. That was the rhythm of her life. The kitchen filled with the smell of it, the yeast, the warmth, the good brown crust. She baked plain, honest bread. Cottage loaves and a heavy brown loaf, coarse and dark, the kind that filled a working man's belly and kept him full till dusk. Her mother had taught her that loaf, her mother's mother before that. She could shape it in her sleep. By 6 she had the cart loaded. Eggs packed in straw, kept from cracking. Winter greens, kale and leeks, and the last of the good cabbage. Jars of her own jam. The bread wrapped in clean cloth. She led the old horse out into the dark and walked the mile down into the town beside him, her breath white in front of her face, her boots crunching on the frozen ruts. The market cross stood in the middle of the square. It was old, older than the church, some said, weathered stone, worn smooth by 600 years of hands. Around it the stalls set up in the dark, the smallholders and the widows and the poor folk who lived by what they could sell. Eleanor had the best pitch, the one nearest the cross. Thomas had held it before her, and his father before him, and it was hers now by right and by custom. Now, I want you to understand something about Eleanor Rooke before we go a step further. Because this is not a story about a poor woman being rescued. This is a story about a woman worth rescuing, and there is a difference. Eleanor kept a ledger, a small book, bound in worn leather that she carried in her apron pocket, and in that ledger she kept the debts of the poorest people in Harrowgill. Not to call them in, to keep them from shame. Here is how it worked. When the workhouse children came past her stall, thin things, blue at the knuckle, she would find that she had greens she could not sell. Bruised, she would say, going over, a pity to waste them, and she would press them into small cold hands and mark nothing in the ledger at all, because there was nothing to mark. When old Mrs. Hartley's pension ran short at the month's end, Eleanor would let her take a loaf and a dozen eggs and write it down, and somehow the writing never became a demand. She knew which debts could be paid and which never could, and the ones that never could, she simply let the years wear away. The town knew this about her. They loved her for it, not with grand words. Yorkshire folk do not deal in grand words, but in the way a butcher would save her the good marrow bone, and the way the carter would haul her broken cart home for nothing, and the way men lifted their caps to her in a manner they did not lift them to richer women. She was the market's heart. Everyone knew it, everyone but her perhaps, for she thought she was only doing what anyone decent would do. And every Thursday, by 9 o'clock, the Aldermere man came and bought her out. She thought nothing of it. Truly, she didn't. She thought it was provisioning for the hall. A great house like Aldermere had scores of servants, grooms and gardeners and kitchen maids, and men who did nothing but polish the silver, and all of them had to be fed. A steward buying up a good stall of bread and greens each week, that was sensible household management, nothing more. She was glad of the custom. It meant a clear stall by mid-morning and a fair purse to walk home with. She had never once met the Duke of Aldermere to speak to. He was a name on a wall, a crest on a wagon, a great grey house up on the hill. He was not a man to her. He was the weather. So that is where we begin. A good woman, a hard living, and a mystery she had long since stopped wondering about. But a mystery does not stay quiet forever. And to understand what the Duke did at the end of this story, you have to understand what he had already done, quietly, for 10 winters. So let me show you 3 of them. The first was the blizzard year. It was the worst winter anyone in Harrowgill could remember. The snow came down for 3 days, without stopping, and the drifts closed the road over the moor entirely. Half the stalls didn't open that Thursday. Only the desperate came down into the square, wrapped to the eyes, stamping to keep the blood moving. Eleanor came. She always came. She'd lost Thomas that autumn, and the cottage was too quiet to sit in, and the work was the only thing holding her upright. She stood behind her stall with her breath freezing on her shawl and thought no one would come at all. The square was near empty. The snow muffled every sound, and then, out of the white, at 9 o'clock exactly, came the Aldermere man. His horse's flanks were steaming, his coat was crusted with ice, he had ridden through drifts a sensible man would have turned back from, and he bought the whole stall, same as always, and took especially the brown loaf, and paid her, and touched his frozen hat, and rode back up into the storm. She stood there afterward with the coin warm in her palm, and thought only, that is a loyal servant, to come out in such weather for kitchen bread. She did not think, why would any household send a man through a blizzard for a widow's greens? She was too tired, and too cold, and too full of her own grief to think it. She went home. But she remembered it. Some part of her kept it, the way you keep a small stone in your pocket without knowing why. The second was the year the cart broke. It was an ordinary autumn Thursday, no drama to it, only that the axle of Eleanor's old cart cracked clean through on the frozen ruts a half-mile from town. She stood in the road with a load of bread going stale and greens going soft and no way to move any of it, and she was too proud to leave it and too weak to carry it, and she felt every one of her years standing there in the grey morning. She thought that day, plain as anything, I am getting old, and there is no one now to mend the cart. And then a haul wagon came down the road, a big flat farm wagon, with 2 men she half knew from the estate, and they drew up beside her without being asked. They said His Grace's steward had sent them down to fetch a load. They said it easy, like it was nothing, like it was the most natural thing in the world for a duke's wagon to be on that particular road at that particular hour. They loaded her whole cart onto theirs. They carried her greens and her bread down to the square. They came back after and hauled the broken cart to the wheelwright and would take no coin for it. She thanked them. She thought it a kindness of the steward, a decent man doing a decent turn. It never crossed her mind to ask how the hall had known her cart would break on that road at that hour, because it hadn't known, of course. It couldn't have. But a wagon that comes down the same road every Thursday to a stall it means to buy, that wagon will be there when the axle goes. She never made the sum. Why would she? Kindness, when you are not looking for its reason, simply looks like luck. The third was the year she was ill. She took a fever in the deep of that winter, the kind that lays a strong woman flat and frightens her neighbours. For nearly 3 weeks she could not stand, let alone bake, let alone walk a mile down to the square in the cold. Her stall stood empty. Her pitch by the cross went bare, the first time it had gone bare in her 30 years, and each Thursday she was abed, a strange thing happened, and she only heard of it after. The Aldermere man came anyway. He came to her empty pitch, where there was nothing to buy, no bread, no greens, no eggs, not so much as a jar, and he left coin. He set it down under the empty basket that stood where her stall should have been, the fair price of a full morning's custom, and he touched his hat to the empty space as though she were standing behind it, and he rode away. 3 Thursdays running. 3 times he paid for goods that were not there. When Eleanor was well enough to hear it, the other stallholders told her, laughing and shaking their heads at the oddness of the gentry. And she found the coin waiting for her, saved by an honest neighbour, and she told herself the steward had simply not been told she was ill, and the man had his orders and followed them, and it was an error, that was all. An overpayment she ought by rights to send back. She never sent it back. She could not have said why. Something in her would not part with it. But she did not let herself think. No servant leaves coin under an empty basket for a woman who cannot serve him. No steward pays for air. She did not let herself think it, because thinking it would have opened a door she was not ready to walk through. Now, here is the thing that the town did not know, and that Eleanor did not know, but that you should know, because it is the small key to the whole lock. It came from the hall kitchens, the way such things do, a cook talking to a carter to his wife to the market. The cook at Aldermere Hall was a proud woman. She baked a white manchet bread, fine and pale and soft, the way the gentry liked it, the way it had been baked at the hall for 100 years. It was said to be the best white bread in 3 ridings, and the Duke would not touch it. Not a crumb. Never had. On his own long table, among the silver and the crystal, with the finest bread in Yorkshire at his elbow, the Duke of Aldermere ate only ever the coarse brown loaf that came up from the market on a Thursday. The rough dark bread a labourer ate. The cook was half offended by it and half baffled, and she said as much to anyone who'd listen. His Grace won't touch the white manchet his own oven bakes, only ever the rough brown loaf from the market, been so for years. And none of us know why. None of them knew why. Keep that loaf in your mind, it is going to matter more than anything. Now the year turns to our Thursday, the one the whole story hangs on. Eleanor came down to the square in the dark, same as always, set her stall by the cross, same as always. The town gathered as the light came grey over the hills, the stallholders, the poor folk with their baskets, the farmers in from the dales. The square filled. And into that full square, a little after 8, came Silas Vane. You have not met Mr. Vane yet, so let me draw him. He was 44. He was the Aldermere land agent, the man who managed the estate's rents and lands and leases in the Duke's name. He was clever and cold and ambitious, and he wore good black clothes and carried himself like a man who has decided the world owes him a great deal, more than it has yet paid. He did not love Harrowgill. He looked at the market square and its worn old cross and its widows selling greens, and he did not see 600 years of custom. He saw money lying idle. And Silas Vane could not abide money lying idle. He came into the square that morning with 2 men and a hammer and a paper, and he walked to the old market cross, and in front of the whole assembled town he nailed the paper to the ancient stone. It was an eviction notice. A hush went over the square. People pressed in to read it, and those who could not read had it read to them, and the words went through the crowd like cold water. The green, the market green that had held the market since before the church was built, was to be enclosed, fenced, closed, and leased to a new concern, the Croft and Marsh Emporium, a great covered market house that would sell everything under one grand roof and pay the estate a handsome rent for the privilege. The old open stalls were finished, and to hurry them off, the tolls were raised from 2 shillings the quarter, which a widow could just manage, to 2 whole pounds the quarter, which no widow on earth could manage. All stalls were to quit the green by Lady Day, the 25th of March. I want you to feel what that was. These were not rich people. These were the folk who lived stall to stall, week to week, the widows and the old men and the poor families who kept body and soul together by selling what little they grew or made. The new toll priced every one of them off the green at a single stroke. It was not a raising of rent, it was a clearing. A whole way of life, 600 years old, wiped off a stone with a hammer and a nail on a cold Thursday morning. And at the top of the notice, in fine black letters, it was done in the name of the Duke of Aldermere. Now here is where I must tell you the cruel joke at the centre of this story. Because the whole town looked at that name, and the whole town believed it. Why would they not? Vane was the Duke's man. The paper carried the Duke's authority, his seal, his name. As far as Harrowgill knew, the great lord up on the hill had decided to enclose their green and turn them all out to line his pockets. They cursed his name that morning, quietly, in the way poor folk curse the powerful, under the breath, with the cap still on. And the terrible irony, the one you can see and they could not, is this. The very same lord whose man was nailing them off the green was the lord who had bought Eleanor's stall in silence for 10 winters. The hand they blamed for casting them out was the hand that had, unseen, been feeding them, but nobody in that square knew it. Not the town, not Eleanor, and though it will take us the length of this tale to understand it, not, in the fullest sense, the Duke himself. The Aldermere man did not come that morning. 9 o'clock came and went, and for the first Thursday any of them could remember. Eleanor's stall was not bought out. She stood behind her bread with the notice on the cross 10 feet from her face, and the custom of 10 winters simply did not arrive. She told herself the hall had other things on its mind, but something cold settled in her all the same. She walked home that day with her cart still half full, and her mind churning. And that night, at her own table, by the light of a single candle, she took out her ledger and did the sum she had been dreading. She owed the tollmaster the new quarter, £2 where it had been 2 shillings, and there was back rent on the pitch, small sums that had built up in a lean year that had never mattered because Vane had never pressed them, and now Vane meant to press everything. She totted it all. £14, 8 shillings. That was what she must find by Lady Day, or lose the pitch her husband's family had held for 3 generations. £14, 8 shillings by the 25th of March. She sat and looked at the number a long time. She had perhaps £3 put by. She could not make up the rest if she sold everything she owned, and she would still have nothing to live on after. It was not a debt. It was a wall, and there was no door in it that she could see. There was one door, of course. A kind man had shown it to her already. His name was Aldous Pike. He was 60, a widower like her, the corn chandler whose shop stood on the corner of the square. He was a good man, solid, honest, well thought of. He had money enough and a warm house and no meanness in him anywhere. And he had loved Eleanor Rooke quietly for years, the way a decent man loves, without pressing, without shaming her, waiting on her grief with a patience that did him credit. He came to her the week after the notice went up. He came to the cottage, and he turned his hat in his hands on her doorstep like a boy, and he said his piece plainly. He said he had admired her a long time. He said he knew this was hard ground to speak on, with the trouble on the green. He said that if she would have him, she need never worry about a toll or a pitch again. She would be Mrs. Pike, a chandler's wife, with a warm house and her own station and no more standing in the cold at dawn. He said it kindly. He did not say it as a rescue, though a rescue is what it was. He gave her the door out of the wall, and he did it with his whole heart, and he asked for nothing but a yes. And Eleanor Rooke, God bless her stubborn head, said no, not unkindly. She was never unkind. She took his hand on the doorstep and she thanked him, and she told him he was the best man in Harrowgill, and she meant it. But she could not. She said her heart was still in the churchyard, and that was true, and it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that Eleanor Rooke would not be saved, would not be a burden, would not be a rescue, would not stand at any man's altar because she could not pay her own toll. It was pride, the good kind and the ruinous kind, all bound together, the way they always are. She would sooner lose the pitch than be handed away to keep it. Aldous Pike went home that night a disappointed man, but he did not stop tipping his cap to her, and he did not stop loving her, and you should remember that too, because that is the mark of a good man, and good men have their place in this story before the end. So Eleanor had turned from the safe door, and then she did a thing that told you everything about who she was. She did not sit down and weep over her own £14. She looked around the square at all the others in the same wall, the widows, the old men, the poor families, and she set herself to holding them together. She became the spine of the market's resistance, though resistance is too fierce a word for it. She organised. She got the stallholders to meet in the back room of the Fleece of an evening, and she made lists of who owed what, and she worked out who might be saved and who could not. And she shared out her own stock to feed the families the notice had already begun to starve. When the Crofton Marsh men came to measure the green with their ropes and their poles, it was Eleanor who stood in the square with her arms folded and made them feel the weight of every eye upon them. She had no money, and no power, and no lord to speak for her. She had only her own 2 hands and the love of a town, and she spent both without stint. There is a phrase for what she was that winter, and it is the plainest phrase in the world. She was the good of the place. And the great cruelty pressing down on all of them wore the name of the man who, had they only known it, valued her above every acre he owned. The weeks went by. February turned hard, then softened toward March. Lady Day came on, and no relief came with it. Vane pressed forward, unrebuked, unopposed by any voice from the hall, because no voice from the hall knew. The notices held, the Emporium's men measured and planned. The tollmaster sent his reminders. £14, 8 shillings, and the 25th of March coming like a tide. And Eleanor, who would not marry her way free, and could not buy her way free, and would not beg, Eleanor came at last to the end of what she could do alone. She sat one raw evening in her cold kitchen, with the ledger shut in front of her and the candle guttering, and she thought about the town, all those people she could not save, and she thought about the pitch by the cross with 3 generations of Rookes standing behind it, and she made up her mind to do the one thing left that she had sworn she would never do. She would go up to the hall herself. She would climb the hill to Aldermere and stand at the great door and demand to see His Grace the Duke face to face and ask him, no, tell him what his enclosure would do to the folk of Harrowgill. She would look the man in the eye. Widow to lord, she would speak for the market that his hammer meant to break. Understand what that was, in that world, in that year. A market widow did not go up to the hall. It simply was not done. The classes did not touch. A woman like Eleanor might live her whole life a mile from a duke and never once stand in a room with him. To climb that hill and hammer on that door was to step clean over a line that had held her people in their place for 600 years. It was the boldest thing she had ever done, and the most desperate, and she knew it, and she meant to do it anyway. She chose a Monday. She put on her good dress, the black one she had married Thomas in and buried him in, the only good thing she owned. She pinned up her grey hair, and she walked out of Harrowgill and up the long road toward the great grey house on the hill. It was 2 miles, and the road was foul with the March thaw. The mud took her boots and near dragged them off her feet, and the wind came down off the moor and made her eyes stream, and by the time the hall came into view, she was spattered to the knee and shaking with cold and with something worse than cold. But she did not turn back. Eleanor Rooke had never turned back from anything in her life, and she was not about to start on the one road that mattered most. The hall rose up in front of her, huge and silent, more windows than she could count, all of it saying, "You do not belong here," in a language older than words. Her heart was going like a hammer. Her ruined boots were sinking in the gravel of the great sweep, and she lifted her chin, the way she lifted it at the men with the measuring ropes, and she climbed the wide stone steps, and she raised her cold fist to the tall front door of Aldermere Hall, a door no woman of her station had knocked upon in living memory, and she brought it down, hard, 3 times, to demand an audience with the Duke. What waited for her on the other side of that door, the reason 10 winters of bread had never once been touched. The thing the Duke of Aldermere had carried in silence for 50 years was about to turn everything Eleanor Rooke believed about her own life clean upside down. But that, dear listener, is where the second half of our story begins. The door did not open at once. She stood there on the cold stone with her fist still half raised, and she listened. Somewhere far inside the house, a bolt drew back, then a chain. Then the great door swung inward on its hinges, slow and heavy, and a manservant looked out at her, a thin old man in black, with a face that had been trained across 40 years to show nothing at all. He looked at her boots first, then him, then her face. "The tradesman's entrance," he said, "is at the rear." Eleanor did not move. Her heart was still going like a hammer under the black dress, but her voice, when it came, was steady. It was the voice she used on the men with the ropes. "I've not come to trade," she said. "I've come to see His Grace. About the green. About the market at Harrowgill. Tell him Eleanor Rooke is at his door, and will wait as long as she must." The old man's eyes moved. Only a little, only the smallest flicker, at the name. And that flicker was the first strange thing, though she was too cold and too frightened to mark it then. "Wait here," he said. He left her on the step. She stood in the wind with the whole grey house rising over her, and she waited, and she thought she might wait an hour and be turned away into the dark. But it was not an hour. It was scarcely 3 minutes. The old man came back, and his face had changed, and he opened the door wide. "His Grace will see you," he said. "Come in out of the cold." She had not expected that. Not any of it. She had walked 2 miles up that road building her arguments like a wall, the 600 years, the widows, the workhouse children, the ledger in her apron pocket. She had made herself ready for a locked door and a hard word. She had not made herself ready to be let in, so she stepped over the threshold of Aldermere Hall, and the warmth of the place came round her like water, and the door closed behind her, and she was inside. They took her through a hall bigger than the Harrowgill church, past paintings of dead men in armour, past a staircase wide enough to drive her cart up. Her ruined boots left dark prints on a floor that shone like a pond. She kept her chin up, she kept her hands folded, and every step of the way one thought went round and round in her, "I do not belong here, I do not belong here, and yet here I am." They put her in a library. It was a cold room for all its books, a long room walled floor to ceiling in leather spines, with a fire laid but scarcely lit, as though no one truly lived in it. She stood by the hearth and warmed her hands and waited, and while she waited, she let herself think of the churchyard, for she had stopped there, that morning, before the long road, before any of it. She had gone in through the light gate with the frost still on the grass, and she had stood at Thomas's stone, Thomas Rooke, joiner, 10 years now under the green, and she had felt, of a sudden, a great and foolish shame to be tramping up to a lord's house in her wedding black, to be putting herself before a gentleman, hat in hand. What would Thomas have said to see his Nell go begging at the hall? And standing there in the cold, she had remembered exactly what Thomas would have said. She could near hear him say it, dry as a shaving off his own plane. That hall fellow's been sweet on your greens for years, Nell. A blind man could see it. You take his coin, and you keep your prices high. She had laughed. Alone in the churchyard with the frost on her husband's stone, she had laughed out loud, and the laugh had turned halfway to a sob, and something in her chest that had been shut tight for 10 years had come loose. Thomas was gone. Thomas was 10 years gone, and he had loved her, and he would not have grudged her a single day of what was left. To go on living was not to betray him. To let a bit of warmth back in was not to spit on his grave. He had told her so himself, in that dry voice, from under the grass. She had wiped her face and squared her shoulders and gone on up the road lighter than she came. She was thinking of that, of Thomas, and the frost and the loosening in her chest, when the far door of the library opened, and the Duke of Aldermere came in. She had seen him but the once, at her own stall, gloved, 4 words and gone. She had thought of him, when she thought of him at all, as a shape in a fine coat. Now she saw a man, an old man, older than she'd fancied, 60 and more, tall but stooping a little at the shoulder, with white hair and a long-lined face and eyes of a pale, tired blue. He was not dressed grand. He wore a plain dark coat, near as plain as Pike's. And he stopped just inside the door and looked at her across that cold room the way a man looks at something he has waited a very long time to see. "Mrs. Rooke," he said. "Your Grace." She dipped him the best curtsy her stiff knees would give. Then she made herself go straight to it, before her courage failed. "I'll not waste your time with pretty words, for I've none. There's a notice nailed to our market cross. Your name is on it. Your seal. It puts the tolls up from 2 shillings the quarter to 2 whole pounds, and it turns every widow and smallholder off the green by Lady Day, and it hands 600 years of market over to a shop. I've come to ask you to your face to stop it. That's all. That's the whole of it." He did not answer at once. He crossed the room slow, and he stood at the far side of the hearth from her, and he looked into the poor little fire. "I know the notice," he said quietly. "I did not order it. My agent, Mr. Vane, acts in my name. He does not always trouble to tell me what my name is doing." He was silent a moment. "That is my fault, and no one else's. A man is answerable for what is done in his name, whether he knew of it or not. The enclosure will not go forward, Mrs. Rooke. You have my word on it. You could have saved your boots." She stared at him. She had come armed for a battle, and the battle had ended before the first blow. It left her strangely empty and strangely suspicious. "Just like that," she said. "Just like that. And the tolls? As they were. 2 shillings, as they have always been." She did not thank him. Something in her would not let her, not yet. There was a thing wrong here, a thing under the smooth surface of it, and she had lived 57 years by trusting the prickle at the back of her neck. "Why?" she said. "Why? Why so easy? A lord doesn't turn his own enclosure round in the space of a breath for a market widow he's never spoke 10 words to. Why?" And there it was. The pale blue eyes came up off the fire and found her face, and in them was a thing she had no name for, a thing that was near to pain and near to relief, and had been kept a very, very long time. "Because," he said, "I have owed you for 50 years, and I have never found a way to pay." The room went quiet as a held breath. "You don't know me," she said. "I've never set foot in this house in my life." "No," he turned to face her full, "but I have set foot in Harrowgill. Once, a long time ago. Sit down, Mrs. Rooke, please. It is a longer story than a market notice, and you have walked 2 miles in the mud to hear it, though you did not know that was what you came for." She did not sit. She stood by the fire in her wedding black, and she waited, and the Duke of Aldermere told her the thing he had carried in silence for 50 years. "I was not born to this," he began. "I was a second son." "Do you know what a second son is, Mrs. Rooke?" "He is a spare. He is the one who does not matter. My elder brother would have the title and the hall and every acre, and I would have whatever I could make him give me. We quarrelled. Boys do, but this was a bad quarrel, a black one, over a matter I'll not shame myself by naming, and at the end of it my father took my brother's side, and I was told to be gone. I was 17. I had a good coat on my back, and not 1 shilling in the pocket of it, and my pride, which was worth even less. And I walked out into the winter to show them all how little I needed them." He looked into the fire. "I got as far as Harrowgill. 2 days on foot, no food, sleeping in ditches, the good coat gone to rags, and the pride gone with it. I came into your market square before it was light, on a morning so cold the water froze in the troughs. I had not eaten in 2 days. I meant, God forgive me, to steal something and be whipped for it, for at least in the lock-up there'd be a fire. I stood by the market cross, and I shook, and I was 17, and I thought I would die, and I did not much care. And a girl came across the square to open her stall, a baker's girl. She could not have been above 12 or 13. She had a basket of loaves against the cold brown loaves, coarse ones, the cheap bread. And she looked at me. 1 look she gave me, the length of the square. And she came straight over, and she did not ask my name, and she did not ask what I was, and she did not preach at me nor call the watch. She put a warm brown loaf into my 2 hands, and she folded my fingers round it so I could not give it back, and she said 4 words, just 4. She said, 'There. That'll mend you.' And she went back to her stall and never looked at me again." Eleanor stood very still. "I ate that loaf in the lee of your church," the Duke said, "and it saved my life. Not my body only. It mended me," as she said. A stranger had looked at me, worthless as I was, and seen a thing worth feeding. I got up off that step a different creature. I went for a soldier. I did well at it, and then, in the turn of 4 years, my brother died of a fever and my father of a broken heart behind him, and the spare, the one who did not matter, came home to be the Duke of Aldermere. I married where I was told. I did my duty by these acres for 40 years. I buried my Duchess, God rest her, a good woman I never quite loved, and she never quite loved me. And we both knew it, and were kind about it. And through all of it, every winter, in the cold and the dark, I thought of a brown loaf and a girl's hand folding my fingers round it. I never knew her name. I never thought to see her again." He looked up. 10 winters ago, he said, I rode through Harrowgill market of a Thursday, and I saw a widow at a stall by the cross, selling coarse brown loaves. She was grey. She was worn. She was near 60, and I knew her hands. Mrs. Rooke, across 40 years and all that grey, I knew her hands. It was you, the baker's girl. You'd married your joiner and buried him, and gone on standing in the same square in the same cold, feeding people who couldn't always pay. I made inquiry. I learned you kept a ledger of debts you never called in. I learnt the town half lived off your kindness. And I found I could not bear it, that you should stand out in the winter with your greens going soft and your loaves going stale, when I had a house with 100 rooms and owed you my whole life." Eleanor's throat had gone tight. She could scarce get the words out. "The man," she said. "The man who buys my stall. Every Thursday. 10 winters. There is no man," the Duke said. "That is, there is a man, he carries the basket, but the custom is mine. I arranged it. Every Thursday. Buy the whole stall," I told him. "Pay her fair and better than fair. Take always the brown loaf, and never, on your life, tell her from whom it comes. She has her pride," I said. "She would sooner starve than take charity from the hall. So we must not let it look like charity. We must let it look like custom." The blizzard year. Her voice was shaking now, when no cart could get up nor down. "Your man came. He came. The year my cart broke on the Harrowgill road and a hall wagon happened by. Nothing happens by, Mrs. Rooke, in my valley that I have not caused to happen. The winter I lay ill 3 weeks and never opened the stall at all, and there was coin under the basket. Every week. Coin under the empty basket for greens I never sold." "Yes," he said, very low. "That was me." She put her hand out to the mantel to steady herself, for the room had begun to go round. 10 winters," she whispered. 500 market days. You bought my whole stall 500 times. I did, and took the brown loaf. Every time. Though they tell me your own ovens bake white bread, fine bread, and you'll not touch it." The old man smiled then. It was the saddest smile she had ever seen on a living face. 10 winters, Eleanor," he said, "and I never once needed the bread. My kitchens could feed a regiment. I needed the hand that baked it. I have been trying, all this while, to answer a loaf I could never repay, and there is no answering it, for what you gave a freezing boy for nothing, no duke can buy back with all his coin. I know that. I have always known it. I did it anyway. It was the only way I had to be near the kindest thing that ever happened to me. And there it was, all of it, out at last in that cold library, 50 years of it laid down between them on the shining floor. She should have wept. Any woman in a story weeps to be told a thing like that. But Eleanor Rooke was not a woman in a story. She was a market widow with 57 years of hard use behind her and a great and terrible pride that had been her armour her whole life long, and the pride, in that moment, was quicker than the tears. She drew herself up, she took her hand off his mantle, and her face, that had been open, closed like a door. 10 years, she said, and her voice had gone flat and cold. 10 years I thought I was making my own way. 10 years I stood in that square with my chin up and thought, whatever else is gone, Eleanor, you've never taken a farthing you didn't earn. It was the one thing I had left. The one thing, and all the while it was you. Pity money, under the basket, a great man's charity, dressed up as custom so the poor foolish widow wouldn't feel the shame of it. Not pity, he said, and for the first time there was something urgent in the old voice. Never once pity. A debt of the, you dressed it as custom, she said over him, hard, so I wouldn't know to refuse it. And that's the truth of the thing, Your Grace. Strip the pretty words away. You knew I'd not take charity, so you tricked me into taking it for 10 years running. My children, her voice caught, and she mastered it. My grown children. Half the town. What'll they say when this comes out, as everything comes out? There goes Eleanor Rooke, that was the Duke's kept widow. There goes the woman he bought, stall and all, 500 times over. Eleanor. Mrs. Rooke. She said it like a slammed gate. I'll thank you to save the green, for that's the poor folks' living, and not mine to be proud with. Save it, and I'll bless your name for it. But you'll not buy my stall again. Not one loaf more. I'll stand in that market, and I'll sell my bread to whoever pays for bread, and I'll take no coin from any hand that means it kind. I have £3 saved in my cottage and my 2 arms and my wits, and I'll not be a duke's charity, Your Grace, not for another single winter, not if I lose the pitch and starve on the road for it. I had one thing that was mine. You've spent 10 years taking it, and never told me you were taking it. I'll say good day." And she curtsied, a short, hard, furious curtsy, and she turned in her ruined boots and walked out of the cold library with her head high, and the old man did not stop her, for there was no thing in the world he could have said that her pride would have let her hear. She went down the great staircase and across the shining floor and out the tall door into the wind. And she walked the 2 miles home in the falling dark, and she did not weep until she was under her own roof with the door shut, and then she wept a long time, and she could not have told you, if you'd asked her, whether it was rage or grief or something with no name at all. And up at the hall, the Duke of Aldermere sat alone by a fire that had near gone out. An old man with his life's one debt refused at last, and below in the town his agent Silas Vane, who had heard nothing of any library and any confession, went on sharpening the eviction like a knife. Lady Day came in cold. It was the last market. Everyone knew it for the last, and so the whole town came down to the square, not to buy, but to be there at the end of a thing 600 years old. The stallholders set up as they always had, from habit, from grief, the way you lay a place at table for the newly dead. And over by the market cross, where the notice still hung, stood Silas Vane in a good coat with 2 clerks and 4 men from the Croft and Marsh Emporium. And the Emporium men had a measuring rope and a look of easy patience. For they knew the law was theirs, and the day was theirs, and by noon the green would be theirs. Eleanor set up her stall for the last time. She'd baked since 4, out of pride, out of habit, out of not knowing what else a body did with such a morning. Eggs, winter greens gone a little limp, and a row of coarse brown loaves, warm still, that no liveried man would come to buy, for she had forbidden it and meant it. Aldous Pike came and stood a while by her stall, his hat in his hands, and offered her, one more time and very gently, his shelter and his name. And one more time, very gently, she thanked him and would not. He nodded as if he'd known the answer. He was a good man. He stayed near her all the same. Vane took out his watch. 10 o'clock. Mrs. Rooke, he called across the square, pleasant as poison. Terms were quit by Lady Day. It's Lady Day. I'll trouble you all to clear the green. And that was when the sound came up the road. Not a carriage, not hooves. The sound of a crowd going quiet all at once, from the top of the square down, like a wind laying the grass flat. The Duke of Aldermere was walking down into Harrowgill market on his own 2 feet. No carriage, no livery, no 4 horses and a crest on the door, just an old man in a plain dark coat, coming down the cobbles alone, with his old manservant hurrying behind, and the whole town parting in front of him like water. He walked to the market cross. He stopped under the notice with his own name upon it, and he turned and faced the square, and when he spoke his voice was not loud, but the silence was so deep it carried into every corner. "I am the Duke of Aldermere," he said. "This notice is in my name. I am here to unsay it." Vane's easy face fell clean off him. "Your Grace," he began, "Your Grace. There's no need. The papers are all in order. I've handled the whole. You have handled it, Mr. Vane." "Yes." The old man did not even turn to him. He spoke to the town. "There will be no enclosure. There will be no emporium on this green. The tolls stand at 2 shillings the quarter, as they have stood since the reign of the 3rd Edward, and they will stand there after I am dead, for I mean to see them fixed there in law this week, past the power of any agent of mine to raise them ever again." He drew a folded paper from his coat and gave it to the clerk of the market, who stood gaping. "Read it out, man, it's a charter. A market charter, in perpetuity, for the green of Harrowgill, in the keeping of one Eleanor Rooke, widow, and her heirs and successors, so long as this town shall stand. Read it, so they all hear it, and so none can undo it." And the clerk read it out, his voice cracking, into a square gone perfectly still. the 600 years made safe forever, in her name, before the very cross where the eviction notice hung. Then the Duke turned to Silas Vane. "You may go, Mr. Vane," he said. "Back to the hall, collect what is yours, and be off it by nightfall. You are no longer in my service." And when the agent started to sputter, red and disbelieving, the old man said only one thing more, dry and quiet and final: "You mistook what I valued, Mr. Vane." Vane looked round the square for one friend and found not one. He shut his mouth. He walked out across the empty green, alone, past the Emporium men who were already, without a word, folding up their measuring rope, and he was gone up the far road and out of Harrowgill and out of this story for good. But the Duke was not finished. He turned from the cross, and he crossed the square, slow, in front of them all, and he came to a stall by the corner, where a grey-haired widow stood in her black wedding dress, with a row of brown loaves before her, and he stopped on the customer's side of it, the way any market-goer stops, and he took off his hat to her. "Mrs. Rooke," he said, "I've come to buy the brown loaf." The whole town was watching. She knew it. She stood behind her scales with her chin up and her heart going, and she said, "Lo, for him, I told you, not one loaf more. I'll not be your charity in front of the whole, not charity," he said. "Look," and he set his coin down on the board, one honest penny, a customer's penny, the price of one loaf and no more. 1 penny, 1 loaf, fair custom, in the open, before the town. I am not buying your stall. I am buying a loaf of bread, like any man. Will you sell me a loaf of bread, Eleanor?" And what could she do? What could any woman do? She took a warm brown loaf in her 2 hands, and the Duke of Aldermere put out his own bare hand across the stall, not to take the bread, but under it, so that when she went to give him the loaf, she gave it into his open palm, and his fingers closed round her fingers and the loaf together, the way a girl's fingers had once closed round his, 50 years gone, in this same cold square before it was light. "There," he said, very quiet, only for her, though the whole town leaned in to hear it. "That'll mend me. It always has." And then, louder, plain, the word he had never once said in 10 winters of buying and never saying, "I have loved you since I was 17 years old and had nothing, and you fed me anyway. I have no way to pay it, but to spend what's left of my life trying. Eleanor Rooke, I'm asking for the hand, not the bread. Marry me. Take my name. Not because I'm a duke. Because I was a freezing boy once, and you were kind to me for nothing, and I have never in 50 years wanted anything but to be near that kindness till I die." She did not answer with words. She reached out her other hand, and she folded it over his, so his and hers and the warm brown loaf were all shut up together in the 2 of them, and she held on, and that was her answer, and the whole town saw it, and the whole town knew. And then the square came apart with the sound of it. Aldous Pike was the first to move. The good corn chandler, the safe man, the one she'd twice refused, he stepped up and put out his hand to the Duke, and his voice was rough, but it was steady. "She was always worth more than the green, your grace," he said. "You've the sense to see it. I'll wish you both joy, and mean it." And he shook the old man's hand before any lord or gentleman could, and he took off his hat to Eleanor, and that was the whole of his grace and his goodbye, and the town loved him for it. Her grown children came pushing through. They'd feared this morning, feared shame, feared to see their mother turned off the land, and instead they found her hand shut in a duke's over a loaf of brown bread, and they wept, both of them, right there in the market, and were not ashamed to. The Emporium men had their rope folded, and their cart turned round. They touched their caps to no one, and rolled quietly away up the North Road. And the market of Harrowgill, 600 years old and saved that hour forever, cheered until the pigeons came off the church tower in a great grey clatter and wheeled over the square where a widow and a duke stood holding. Between them, a single loaf of bread. It was high summer when I saw the last of them, and there is not much more to tell. The market thrives. It runs under its perpetual charter, the tolls fixed at 2 shillings the quarter for as long as there's a Harrowgill to hold it, and every widow and smallholder that Vane would have priced off the green keeps her pitch. The stone cross still stands, and there is no notice on it now but the charter itself, framed under glass, with the name of Eleanor Rooke lettered plain across the foot of it, keeper of the market. She is a duchess now. The town still can't quite say it with a straight face, and neither can she. She lives up at the hall, and there is a coach if she wants it, and 100 rooms, and silver on the long table. But 2 days a week, by her own choosing and against all sense and every argument the old Duke can make, the Duchess of Aldermere puts on a plain dress and comes down to the square and sets up her own stall by the cross and sells her eggs and her greens and her brown loaves, and keeps her own ledger of who can't quite pay, and never calls a poor debt in. A duchess who will not give up her scales, they say. And her husband walks down most mornings on his own 2 feet, plain-coated, and stands on the customer's side of her stall and buys 1 brown loaf for 1 honest penny, and takes it out of her hand the same way every time. And on the long table at Aldermere Hall, among the silver and the crystal and the fine white manchet loaves the great ovens still turn out, there sits, every single day, 1 coarse brown loaf, baked that morning by the Duchess's own 2 hands. It is the first thing he reaches for. It always has been. Some debts of the heart take 50 years to pay, and they are worth every winter of the waiting, every cold market dawn, every stale loaf, every silent Thursday of a love that could not find the words. 2 who were kind to each other once, long ago and for nothing, sitting at last of an evening on the same porch, watching the same sun go down over the same green they saved. That's the whole of it. That's the story of the widow, and the Duke, and the bread that mended them both. If it warmed you even a little, tell me the town you're listening from tonight. I do so love to see how far these stories travel.